Hey guys, so today we are going to look at what happened after the initial wave of Age of Exploration happened and these European powers begin to settle and colonize the New World. So first, what do I mean by a colony? So a colony can really be boiled down to a settlement in a new land. This settlement is controlled by a distant mother country, so England, Spain, France, whatever. The land itself is founded for many different reasons. It could be found just to gain territory, to increase trade, for religious freedom. There are a lot of reasons that we'll get more into in just a second. But the idea of a colony is that it provides wealth and resources to the home country. This is not a relationship that goes both ways. The colony is there to provide for the mother country. While the colonies will have some local government, they do not have full independence. They are being completely controlled in many ways by the country that founded it, right? So why are people settling? Why are they doing these colonies, right? So obviously first is for wealth and resources. Spain's early settlements focus mostly on extracting like the gold and silver from the mines to enrich the crown. England, when they initially are doing their settlement, it is about trade profits. Jamestown is founded because of tobacco cultivation. French colonists are looking for fur and participating in the fur trade, timber, other raw materials that can be exported back to Europe. Europe is running low on natural resources, and basically the idea is that the colonies can provide those things that are starting to go missing in Europe. There is also an element of religious freedom. There are religious groups who are being persecuted in Europe, such as the Pilgrims and the Puritans, and they saw the New World as a chance to practice their religion freely. Spanish missions in Florida and New Mexico and California were established to sort of convert the indigenous populations to Catholicism. So there is still an element of conversion, but I think this is the big difference between Catholic and Protestant. Catholics are looking to convert. Protestants are looking to practice their religion without say from the government. While they will convert, it is not something that they are focused on at this time. Next is obviously trade and expansion. Monarchs are competing for the strategic control of land and sea routes. This one is about like monarchs getting one up on each other, right? And settlements allow these nations to claim extra territory. They can defend their trade routes from these colonies, expand their global influence. And so this is all about expanding the empire. Now, some people are looking to escape from poverty or political conflict. This is particularly true of like younger sons with no inheritance, right? Like their dads don't have money for them, so they go to the New World to try to find a new way. People who are political dissenters, so they are against the government of their home country, so they're looking to get out. Peasants who are looking for an opportunity of land ownership that they don't necessarily get as part of this. Many of these colonies are supported by what are known as joint stock companies. So we're going to talk more about what those are in a second. But this is a way that investors can pool money and sort of share the risk. And it offers ways for people who may not normally have been able to afford to do something like this to get involved. So as you can see, there's a lot of religious and social reasons why people are going to settle in the New World and why these colonies are founded. So where are the colonies? In North America, it is mostly English and French settlements. So the English are settling along the Atlantic coast, places like Jamestown in Virginia, Plymouth in Massachusetts in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. France is settling in Canada, Quebec, and Montreal, mostly focusing on the fur trade. There are some Spanish settlements in Florida that sort of serve as like religious and military outposts, but for the most part, Spain doesn't get very far into the East Coast. Now, they will eventually get to the West Coast, so like California, New Mexico, Utah, that kind of area. But for the most part, the East Coast is going to be dominated by France and England. In terms of the Caribbean, that is really where the Spanish are really colonizing a lot of islands like Cuba, Hispaniola. They are setting up key sugar plantations there, and these islands are going to serve as hubs for shipping goods, enslaved Africans, that sort of thing. Also in South America, the Spanish are controlling mostly coastal cities, places like Lima in Peru, Buenos Aires in Argentina. These are going to be trade ports. Cities are often located on rivers for coastal trade because there's easier access that way. But I also want to point out the Dutch over here in Indonesia. Now, the Dutch do actually get one little settlement in South America. They originally founded New York. That was originally called New Amsterdam. But the Dutch are really going to make their most of their money in what is now Indonesia. So islands like Java, Sumatra. They became known as the Spice Island or the Spice Islands, and the purpose is the spice trade there. So that's going to become really important. So settlers are obviously going to prefer fertile soil for crops, fresh water, natural harbors for trade, which is why a lot of these are right along the coast, right? So that's important. In terms of how, founding a colony is expensive. And so these colonists had to find ways that they could be able to get involved in this. So one of the most common is the joint stock company. So one of the most famous joint stock companies is Virginia Company, which funds the settlement of Jamestown, just as a reminder. So the idea of these joint stock companies is just like they said in the song, right? You pull your resources, you pull money, you fund settlements, and eventually, while colonists had charters that guaranteed them land and rights, investors are the ones earning the profits on their crops and their trade goods. So that money goes back to the company, right? A nugget for my Winnie, another one for me, and all the rest goes to the Virginia Company, right? So that's kind of the idea behind that. Also, there are some companies that are formed by specific nations as well. So in the Netherlands, the Dutch East India Company is founded in 1602 to control Dutch trade in Asia and the Caribbean. The Dutch East India Company kind of operated like its own little government. They could make treaties, raise armies, build forts. They were incredibly powerful. There was also the East India Company from the British, and they are, while they're called the East India Company, they're actually funding a lot of the early trade in North America and the Caribbean, eventually expanding into India. But they are similar to the Dutch East India Company, where they are financing a lot of these overseas exploration without state control. That's kind of the idea behind it. We also do see kings who have charters that they are able to give. So these are called royal charters. And basically, the king says, I am founding this company in my name. And the king's charter means that the king is basically the one that controls the company rather than a joint stock or a colony rather than the joint stock company. So the impact of these joint stock companies is that they are reducing the financial risk for settlers and monarchs, linking these colonies to global trade networks, laying the foundation for something called mercantilism, which we'll talk more about in the next unit, and allows like private enterprise to sort of drive colonization alongside these state goals. But like I said, there are still royal colonies. Now, obviously, once they get here, there are some major challenges that these colonists are going to have to face. So first of all, they were not prepared for the climate of North America in particular, especially when we look at the English and the French. And there are some harsh winters and extreme weathers, and many people, as a result, died. It was almost believed that like half of the colony would probably die. In 1609 to 1610, Jamestown faced what was known as the starving time, which was a really harsh winter that killed a lot of settlers. They just didn't have food that they were able to grow. They didn't understand the climate. There are even reports that people resorted to cannibalism and eating their dead during this period because they had no other food source. Northern colonies in New England experienced really cold winters that limited their growing seasons, and they didn't know what they were dealing with. So all of this is going to lead to some pretty extreme conditions that people have to survive. There is also disease and a lack of medical knowledge. Poor sanitation and contaminated water causes some high mortality. Diseases like dysentery, malaria, smallpox. So disease is often going to kill more settlers than contact with native people. Like we often talk about like the fights between natives and the settlers, but in the truth, disease kills more people than conflict does, and that's important to note. There are also, obviously, as a result of all of these things, food shortages. Settlers are initially struggling to grow enough food. The crops are unfamiliar. The soil conditions were unfamiliar, and dependence on supplies with England was unreliable. And so some settlements only survived through trading or assistance with native peoples. If you think like the story of the first Thanksgiving, that's kind of where that comes from. But it took a long time for people to learn how to farm in these new conditions. Of course, there were also conflicts with the native peoples. Tensions arose over land and resources, cultural misunderstandings. There are conflicts with the Pequot and the Wampanoag in New England, the Powhatan in Virginia. Sometimes they did form alliances and trade, but they have to learn each other's language. There's miscommunication and competition and violence that leads to this. So that's going to be a huge part of this. There's also some isolation and logistics issues. Settlers are far from support. The distance from Europe limits the amount of supplies they're able to get, and it's harder to restock. If you're familiar with the story of the lost colony, this was the main problem there. Queen Elizabeth delayed restock of the colony for a really long time. And so by the time that they came back to the colony, it had vanished. Possibly what we think is that the colonists went and kind of went to live with some of the local native tribes because they were running out of supplies and food. But these challenges really made early settlements very fragile. Only those with like a very strong organization and resources and people that were cooperating with the natives were the ones that survived and thrived. Economic backing does help some of the colonists because they provide funding and supplies and leadership, but even that is not guaranteed, right? In terms of the social impact of colonies, mostly we're going to be looking at the social impact on the native populations. So smallpox, measles, and influenza killed millions of indigenous people, especially in the Caribbean and Central and South America. It is estimated that some regions lost up to 90% of the native populations in the first 100 years of European contact. And that is huge. These people didn't have the natural immunity that a lot of Europeans had built up for it. So something that would have been a mild disease for Europeans could wipe out up to 100% of the population. So huge amounts of people died as a result. Of course, colonists are also claiming land for plantations and towns and mining operations, which takes away the land and resources of the native population. They are disturbing like the hunting and farming areas, forcing migration and conflict with the native populations. There are also some labor systems that are being used. So Spanish colonies use something called the encomienda system, which requires indigenous labor for plantations and mines. This is basically the first form of slavery that comes into the United States. European settlers would also sometimes force natives into trade or seasonal labor on plantations. And while there are some alliances, like the Huron in Canada allied with the French for fur trading, these alliances are not stable. They do sometimes shift the balance of power, creating even conflicts between European nations, but it's not a perfect solution. And for the most part, the natives are negatively impacted as a result. In addition, there is African slavery that is brought. So in 1619, the first African slaves are brought to these colonies. Basically, what they realized is that the native populations were dying too quickly. They knew the territory too well, and so they were able to escape from the encomiendas and the plantations. And so they realized that they needed to bring in other labor sources, which were more reliable and they found that African slavery was that labor source. So African slaves are brought in through the Middle Passage. This was the name for the route between the Americas and Africa. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but obviously this is going to have a major impact on society in the United States and South America. Uh, there's also something that in South America that is established known as the Hasta system. So the Casta system is the social hierarchy or social classes that develops in South America, and it's a very rigid, strict social hierarchy. And there is like very particular places that you belong in society based on the way you were born. So the three main groups are the Peninsulares, the Creoles, and the Mestizos. So the Peninsulares are at the top of society. These are European-born Spaniards, and they are the ones who are controlling the government, controlling the church, the military. They're holding the top positions. Then there are the Creoles. Creoles are European descended, but they are born in the colonies. They are often still wealthy and landowners, but they are below the peninsulares in political power. So those born in Spain come first, then those born in the colonies. Then below that are people who are mixed with European and native ancestry. They are usually working as artisans, small farmers, minor officials. And then below that, at the very bottom, are people who are the indigenous populations and the Africans. These are the ones with the most labor intensive jobs, farming, mining, domestic work. Um, they have the lowest social and political status. This hierarchy is going to shape social and economic relations in Latin America for centuries. And it actually gets even more divided than this. Like if you have like a black mom and a native dad, that changes things. If you have a black dad and a native mom, that changes things. So depending on the mix of your race, it could very much depend on what role you got to play in society. So just going back to the Middle Passage for a second, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the slavery that existed in the United States or in the Americas. So obviously slavery existed in most of the world prior to European colonization. It existed in Africa, Europe, Asia, all of these places. The Atlantic slave trade begins in around the 1400s after European exploration along the west coast of Africa. And as Europeans increased demand for labor in the Americas, especially for sugar, tobacco, rice, cotton, all of these things, it increased the demand for slave labor. Now, originally, it is African rulers and traders who capture and sell prisoners of war or enslaved people to the African or to the European traders. However, eventually it does evolve into even kidnapping that happens there. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, it's estimated that approximately 12 to 13 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic through the Middle Passage. Most Africans were taken to the Caribbean and South America. A smaller percentage went to British North America. But what makes slavery different in the Americas is that slavery in the Americas becomes race based and hereditary, meaning that it is tied to African ancestry and passed down to your children. That was not automatically true in other enslaved populations. But this time, this is what we call chattel slavery, where enslaved people were treated as property under law. Now, African slaves did bring agriculture, metalwork skills, craftsmanship, rice cultivation, that all comes with them. African cultures, language, religion, music, food always significantly influence the African societies. But the long-term impact, obviously, is that the Atlantic slave trade is really going to reshape the populations both of Africa and the Americas. While it contributes to the economic growth of the European colonies and allows, these plantations to flourish, it also causes long-term social and political instability in Africa and the racial hierarchy in the United States. And obviously, it will remain legal in the United States until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865. The Middle Passage itself was an incredibly terrible journey. That is the voyage from West Africa to the Americas. Enslaved people are transported in crowded ships in harsh conditions. People are chained together. There's little space to move. Food and water are limited. Sanitation is poor. Disease spreads incredibly quickly. It's estimated that up to 20% or more of captives died during the voyage. The journey was about 6 to 10 weeks, depending on weather. And while there were some captives who resisted or went on hunger strikes or committed suicide, for the most part, this was an economic commodity. And so people were trying to prevent that from happening. And so um, it was an incredibly harsh voyage. And I think it's important that we remember that as we continue to talk about uh, what we're looking at here. So continuing with that economic impact, obviously the plantations and cash crops are going to be a huge part of this culture. The biggest crops that we have developing are sugar, tobacco, and cotton. The name for the trade network is sometimes called the Triangle Trade, which is, if you look, the triangle goes in between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. So stage one is the raw materials that go to Europe from the colonies. So tobacco, rum, sugar, things like that. Then from Europe, the manufactured goods go to Africa. So again, guns, cloth, things like that. Stage three, the slaves go from the Africa to the Americas. They produce the raw materials and it starts all over again. Right? So it's kind of the idea. Colonies are exporting the raw materials, Europe is manufacturing the goods, and then the goods go back and are sold to Africa and the Americas. As a result, colonies generated huge amounts of wealth for their European nations. So they're not necessarily making wealth for themselves, they're making wealth for their mother country. So this is something called mercantilism, where nations are competing to extract resources and control trade from their colonies. This also leads to something known as the Columbian Exchange. And this is probably one of the biggest impacts of this time period. So this is the movement of plants and animals and diseases between the three continents of the Americas, Europe, and Africa. So the thing about some of the goods that we have is I think oftentimes we forget that they are not native to where we are. So if you take a look at this map here, you can see some of the goods that are exchanged back and forth. So things like pumpkins, turkeys, tomatoes, corn, beans, chilies, all of these things are native to the Americas that had never been seen in Europe before. So those things leave the Americas, go to Europe. Then from Europe, things like grapes, olives, bananas, citrus fruits, coffee, and I should say Europe and Asia, right? Grains like wheat, rice, they are coming from the old world to the new world. But there are also diseases that move. Smallpox, measles, malaria, whooping cough, flu. These things are mostly coming from the old world to the new world. There are some diseases that get transported from the new world to the old world. We think syphilis, which is a STD, actually comes from the New World. But for the most part, diseases are going that or from the old to the new. But this is going to have a huge impact on society in the long term. If you just think about it, things like Italian food. Italian food is based primarily on tomatoes. Guess what? Italian food didn't have tomatoes until the 1500s. Potatoes we often associate with Ireland. They didn't have potatoes until the 1500s. So this is huge, right? Now, in terms of the long-term impact of colonization, first of all, this is the foundation of the modern North and South American nations, right? The United States, Canada, Mexico, Peru, Brazil, all of this, Colombia, all these nations that exist in our world today got their start here. It's why we speak English because we were colonized by the British. Why Quebec speaks French because they were colonized by the French. Why Brazil speaks Portuguese while the rest of South America speaks Spanish. All of these things are part of this massive cultural blending that happens between the European, the Native Americans, and the Africans as they mix language and religion and customs and developing new cultures. So if you've ever heard of like the Creole culture, that's a new culture that's developed as a result. This also leads to massive expansion of European empires. Colonization strengthens Spain, England, and France and the Netherlands globally. Competition for colonies led to conflicts between these nations. So, you know, this English and the Spanish are going to go to war. The Dutch and the English go to war over trade. So these European empires are going to become stronger, but it's also going to lead to some massive conflict. Finally, there is some massive economic legacies in the trading companies and the joint stock companies. They really shape modern capitalist ideals. And in the long term, it becomes the foundation for colonial resistance. So colonies are not going to be happy with the lot they've been given forever. And a lot of the independence movement is laid by the economic exploitation and the social hierarchies and the cultural blending that comes from this, you know, time, right? The American Revolution obviously could not happen if the colonies hadn't been colonized. But all of these things come together to really enforce what the impact was of this period. So this wraps up what we are doing today. I will catch you next time. Until then, hope you learned something, and I'll see you soon. Bye.